Welcome back to Expert Instruction, the Teach by Design podcast, where we dive deeper into the research surrounding student behavior by talking with the people who are implementing these practices, where they work, and with the students they support. I'm Megan Cave. It's that time of year where teams come together, data in hand, maybe kind of scooped up into a pile, and where they get down to the business of trying to make sense of everything that just happened. In this PBIS world where we live, I've seen the acronym DBDM, or database decision making, more and more frequently. Maybe you have too. It's as if the process could somehow get whittled down into something so casual, like, oh yeah, we make database decisions all the time. The thing is, it's starting to feel like the term or the acronym has been used so much in the way that we talk about PBIS that maybe we've lost just how complicated a task it really is. The process of analyzing graphs, creating action plans, and making informed decisions affecting the way your school supports everyone, that takes real work. The process of using data like this isn't going to look the same for every team either. I mean, it's flexible enough, right, to fit any context, but actually, turns out there are some norms that can help get you started. I mean, did you know that there were norms? I didn't, but yeah, there are. There are norms, you guys, and that's why we invited our guests today. Dr. Jessica Swain Bradway is with us. And Jessica, she's the executive director for the Northwest PBIS network. In her work with schools, she focuses on equipping teachers with high leverage strategies for instruction, relationship building, and for designing effective learning environments. And Dr. Billie Jo Rodriguez is with us as well. Billie Jo comes to us from the Northwest PBIS network too. She has more than 20 years of experience supporting students with diverse social and academic behavior needs and supporting schools in the way that they respond to and prevent disruptive behaviors. You guys, these women, they're coaches, like real coaches through and through. And every time I talk to them, I'm reminded of the way that access to coaching can strengthen and sustain the systems and practices you're already implementing. And I'm telling you that this episode is no different. During our conversation, we'll get into the core components, the real nitty-gritty of what it means to use data to drive decisions. You'll hear their real-world examples of how their teams have been able to make data a regular part of every team meeting, just so naturally. If you have found yourself right now in a place where you just don't know where to start using the data that you have to shape your decisions, guys, Billie Jo and Jessica are about to give you some really tangible first steps to get you moving in the right direction. Jessica and Billie Jo, thanks for being here today. Okay, so when we were talking about this episode, Jessica, you brought up something that I've actually heard quite a bit in passing, and I've just sort of taken it as like, oh yeah, sure, I know what that means, but I don't actually. So I'm super glad that you're here to tell me all about it. You had actually said that in your experience with schools, you've noticed that people are data rich and information poor. And I would really love for you to say more about that. Like, what is the difference between having data and having information? And why would it be important to make that distinction and to maybe encourage people to have more information at their disposal?
Well, first of all, thank you for having us, Megan. And I stole that from somewhere else. Some very smart person way before me said that. And I think it really summarizes very well this kind of the traditional system we've inherited in schools and for data, is that it's an input only type of system, right? So information is one direction, and that is kind of the backdrop for some of the pieces we're stuck in, if you will. And one way information is not culturally responsive, it's not equitable in any way, doesn't inform mental health prevention, right? It's very one directional. So a lot of times we're putting a lot of information, a lot of data into various systems that are meant to store and hang out there and go on to somewhere else, but are not immediately available to us as educational decision makers. So if you kind of look at that in contrast with really, really good reading programs, really robust reading programs and approaches. Teachers get immediate information about what's going on with the kids' reading skills and will change their instruction based on that. That's information that shifts their behavior. But unfortunately, in a lot of our districts, we're stuck with those one direction data systems that don't allow us to have real information to act on. So that's a lot of times what I see as a real hindrance in our districts for doing high quality support work for kiddos.
Yes, it's that interpretive component. It's somehow transforming the data point that you enter into a system into actual information that you can use to change something about the way that your school works, or the way that you do things in your building, or the way that students interact with each other. Yeah, I think that's really key.
I recently ran across an analogy
Oh,
that I really related to. It's a visual analogy, so we'll make it work on the podcast, but is thinking about data and buildings, trying to use data in districts, thinking about it like Legos, which I can relate to. My son is almost 7. And so, and so the big pile of just jumbled up pieces in the floor, is often what schools are looking at, is just lots of pieces that have been put in a pile that aren't necessarily telling them anything meaningful, or, and so it takes a lot of construction. Sometimes there's direction. Sometimes it's that creativity of like, what is it that I want to know? What am I trying to really understand? And do I even have the right pieces in the pile to build my, my design, or do I not have any wheels? And so I think for me, that analogy has really been helpful in thinking about our role in making sure we have the right Legos in the pile, or we can find the ones we're looking for. And then when we do have those piles, not just sorting them by color or sorting them, in some way that's someone else created, but actually sorting those into a way that we can design the story or the understanding of what that information is actually building for us, and then how we can use that to create, essentially better outcomes for kids if we follow the analogy all the way through. So that Lego analogy has been a helpful way for me to think about how complicated sometimes the work is.
Sure. I do too, because I start to think about how I see Legos, and how I can build with them versus how my kids play with them, versus how someone who is on one of those shows where they build these crazy things with Legos. And I think about how we could all look at the same pieces of data and create some different solution based on that, on all of those, depending on our context, depending on our role within the building. So it's a really good analogy that you can actually take in a lot of different ways. So
I love it.
I do too. I do too. How do you help schools? Like, so in your roles as coaches, when you're working with school teams and they've got all of these pieces of information in front of them, how do you help them to transform their data into information that they can use for making decisions?
Well, I like to joke that we shame them. We just shame the grown-ups until they make the choice we want them to do. But that's just because I like to joke about it. It's interesting. I love that Lego analogy. And then Megan, I love how you brought it around to, I could make anything I wanted from those Legos. And this is why I love our framework that says, you still have to follow the evidence. You still have to follow the strategies to get to the behavioral outcomes you want. Because I think about this idea of how far away are we from the thing we want to see change? And that takes us to, is it observable? Is it measurable? Which helps us avoid inference. And we avoid inference, we're less likely to fall into the implicit bias camp, right? We're less likely to blame a kid for having anxiety and just see it as a behavior. So I really love to back out and say, what's the thing you want to see be different? And really support folks to be as concrete as possible, and then say, what's the most direct measure you have of that? Because even something like check-in, check-out points is nice. And if we're doing check-in, check-out really well, then we're giving a kiddo feedback and the points reflect how they're doing that day. But those aren't the points we're going to hang our hats on for a successful human being at the end of the school year. So try to get folks very concrete, move away from inferences and those big assumptions, and say, let's see and hear that thing. And what do you want to be different there? And we kind of start with big picture and back out to there.
Yeah, I would echo that. My notes when I was thinking about this particular question is starting with asking what it is that you want to know, right? And I'm very behavioral by training, and that's the way that I operationalize and view the world. And so, what Jessica was getting at was operationalizing that. Like, what does it look like and sound like and feel like? And then what information or data do you have that could answer what it is that you want to know? And sometimes schools have the potential to answer it, but their data aren't believable. They aren't valid, right? And so we have to kind of look at, do you have it? Is it actually accurate? Whose voice is represented in that data? How did we gather it? What source did it come from? Because I think that's been a big learning for a lot of our schools is they say, I want to know this and I want to have this, and here's the data that I have, but actually I have this lived experience that's telling me that this isn't valid. And those are only in those cases where we can see it, right? So the likelihood of picking that up when we are thinking about, some of those topics around equity or historically underserved populations where maybe we don't see from our lived experience because it's the students is different than our lived experience. So yeah, and then I think as we do that, we spend a lot of time looking at strengths and then the holes. And so I think our teams and our schools, educators that we work with can be really critical of themselves. And so I think as coaches, we have to back up and say, what are you doing well and how do we leverage that and do more of that? And then, also, like Jessica was saying, look for those holes in our system before we jump to trying to fix or, what people talk about as othering, right? Blaming the group or the student or the problem is really kind of take that step back and say, okay, here's our strengths. Here's some things we're missing in our system based on our data, based on our lived experiences. So there's a lot of reframe there too, in terms of how we think about what the data mean, because I think as educators, often our tendency is to go to fixing the problem that's most in front of us, when a lot of times the data are indicating maybe there's a systems challenge or something that is going to be a longer term fix than the students need.
Yeah, I think it's a human experience to try and when you see something or you hear about a problem, if someone's talking to you and saying like, oh, I'm really struggling with this thing. I think as a listener and a human being and a friend and someone who has, empathy for someone, your initial response is going to be, well, here, what can I do to help? How can I help you fix whatever's going on and make it better? So I think that it makes a lot of sense to me that people would be looking at the data that they have in front of them, looking for the problems and immediately jumping into solutions. Yeah. And so what I'm hearing though, is that like, there is a step to discussing. And I think that's where we get into this. How do you actually use data to shape the decisions that you are trying to make? That there's a step that needs to be put in place where you're actually looking at the data and then you're using it to inform how you're going, the solutions that you have in front of you, rather than just looking at data and jumping to solutions. That you actually need to have a process to, I don't know, go over the information and make it make sense. Yeah. So what would be
norms? Norms. I mean, that is something we've really been learning, I think, is there actually need to be explicit norms around how we're going to talk about and look at and use our data. And for me, I mean, as a coach, that's been a newer learning, I think. We've had a lot of other norms about how you run your meetings, how you yes. start and end and all of those things, but really having some norms around the conversations that we're going to have, the processes that we're going to take when we do this work is important.
Say more about that. Yeah. Tell everybody, what are these norms? Fill us in. Don't gatekeep, man.
I almost almost feel like these things will change depending on where people are in terms of their fluency with the idea that behavior is contextual, right? So I know that Billie Jo and I, that we'll go in and say, are these data reliable? Do they really reflect what you think is going on in this moment? And that's where that lived experience comes up, and people say, no. Yeah. And, oh, we're seeing more. This is crazy. All of our kids with IEPs have 500 referrals. I mean, you hear these big things that really reflect emotion. And so that are these data really what you see going on in the day-to-day experience of teachers is a great place to start. And then depending on where folks are with their fluency and their capacity to do the work, because that's something we have to really take into consideration as coaches. Do they have capacity for administrators to support teachers to write the referrals accurately? That means that they understand the differences between this is not really a big deal on the big deal wheel, or man, this is really disruptive to learning. And so we really kind of pick through what do they do well that we can maximize, so they aren't getting these like, oh my gosh, you're the worst type messages, or they don't feel that way. But I would say starting with the idea that it's really normal and important for us to look at our data in front of us and not take it personally, right? It's not personal, but if we go back to that direct connection between the behavior and how we influence that behavior to change in a positive way, we can't have a conversation about the kiddo behavior without having a conversation around the fidelity of our behavior. And systems are created through our collective behavior, right? We need those things there. So normalizing that my behaviors as a teacher influence kid behavior, normalizing that we look at information and it's not a personal attack, it's just information in front of us to shift. I think those are two big norms that probably carry through. And then depending on where folks are in terms of their fluency with some of these ideas, that will kind of change and shape over time where our focus goes as coaches.
I see.
Yeah, and then I think there's some guidance that teams have been asking us for, and I love the cultural responsive field guide. I've been using that a lot.
Isn't it wonderful?
Yeah. And there's some operating procedures and some enhancements around, supportive environment and teaming, particularly around reviewing data, and things like, discussing issues of race or culture openly and respectfully, those kinds of pieces, making sure that we make an explicit effort to look at our data, in a disaggregated way. And then, like I mentioned, kind of from the earlier around coming back to what we can influence and where our changes are, and not blaming, right? Or turning it into a judgment about, groups of students or their needs or their teachers or their families. And so, but it takes it takes practice, and it takes being clear about, the process and doing it, because it is not always comfortable initially, until we get past that place of just recognizing that this is part of, the way that we do things, and making that be part of our procedures.
I think the norm of a meeting agenda that requires we use data, a norm of we look at our risk ratios across our different groups of students at every meeting that we have, meeting norms where disagreement is okay. I mean, the things that facilitate those harder conversations and continue to make us accountable for those conversations, those are really critical, and we can't just allow them to be if there's one really strong facilitator. So yeah, we've got Megan, she's our facilitator, she's going to keep us on track. But those agendas and those norms that are part of every team meeting, so that we can't continue to escape when a conversation is difficult, right? If it's because, wow, look, all of our students in this group are doing really great, or all of our students in this group are doing poorly, and I'm being facetious with all, but those are some of the norms and the systems pieces that guide our collective behavior in the direction of the real way to put those Legos together, which is like, you want to build the Death Star. There is an exquisite map and booklet that is probably, actually, it's 4 booklets long. I know, because we have it, and you can follow that and build the Death Star. So that's that fidelity piece again, that, we want to go back and look at those fidelity data too, of the things that we're doing in the school environment, and look at that as telling it is part of the complete story when we look at the kiddo outcomes too, right? We can't just do one or the other.
Right. I wanted to go back to something too that you had said, Billie Jo, about like when you're talking about the things that you're doing well, and then understanding when your data are actually telling you that you need to do something about your systems. How do you know when that's the case? How do you know that it's a systems issue and not something else?
Yeah, that sounds like an easy question. But
I know I ask it knowing that it's definitely not, but I think that this is something that's come up for me. It's a question that's come up for me. That's like, when I'm looking at something, how do I know that like the system is actually working the way that we intend it to, and that what we're seeing is actually reflective of something else that's going on in the building?
Yeah, well, one way that we know is I think we need to look at how many kids and people it's impacting. And so I've sat in meetings, sometimes tier 2 meetings, and it sounds like, oh, we're looking at Megan's data and she's not making progress. And so we're figuring out, oh, she's not coming to check out at the end of the day. So let's do something different for Megan. And then we go to Jessica and we have a similar conversation. And as a coach, by the time we've had that similar conversation about 3 or 4 kids, I'm like, hold on a minute, what's happening at the end of the day?
Yeah.
Oh, those kids are all in 5th grade and PE is happening and they're missing PE to go to check out. And so guess what's happening? They're not accessing that part of their intervention because it's conflicting with a preferred activity. And so that's an example of where, rather than trying to solve student by student by student, when we can back up and say, oh, the way we've set up our system for this group, whether it's all of our kids or some of our kids, is not working, then we can be much more efficient. So that's one key, is looking at how much impact are we having. I think another piece for me is kind of thinking of systems are those things that help adults, right? Like tell us what to do. And so when adults are, they've got a good practice in their hands, they've got something evidence-based like check in, check out, and they're doing it pretty well, then that's another indication of like, okay, how can we kind of back up here and look at why is this thing that we are trying to do that we know should be working, not working, especially when we're looking at multiple students being impacted or multiple adults. So that's my biggest cue, is how the sphere of influence, and it might not be a lot. Sometimes it could be a systems thing, but it's all of our students from a certain group that are being impacted. So it's not always about overall numbers, but also those kind of disaggregated numbers too, where we're looking at having an impact on groups of students. This might be too tangential, but I'm going to say it now because it relates to this. I've been thinking about this a lot. And kind of those systems pieces is another way that this has come up. And my thinking about it has really changed over the last few years. And in some ways, you know better, you do better. I guess I'll refrain from feeling guilty. But I think about times when we've been problem solving for students in intervention, and using data, right? And doing something like check and check out, and they're making progress. And the teachers come back to me and said, well, should I keep doing this other thing that I'm doing with my whole class with this student? Because it seems to be making this one student or sometimes group of students behavior worse. Back in the day when we didn't always have all the evidence around clip charts, for example, and we had many teachers that were doing that, they would say, should I keep using this clip chart practice for this student now that I've got them on this check and check out intervention, because the clip chart doesn't seem to help. And in fact, it kind of makes things worse. And I remember saying, no, don't do that clip chart thing anymore. Just do the thing that works. But now when I think about that from kind of an equity lens and from a data lens, we should probably not be doing things that are harmful to some kids for any kids. So that's another example of a systems piece, even though some kids weren't necessarily being harmed or it wasn't necessarily making their behavior worse, it's a good example of that system behind that practice wasn't supporting all of our students. And so when we think about access, and our data showing who's accessing the things that we are doing, that's another piece, is if it's not working and it's actually harmful for some students, then we probably should be examining whether that system or practice should be in place for any students, even if for some of them it's not necessarily appearing to be harmful, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. Thinking about the data that you're looking at related to one student or a group of students and saying this practice isn't working for them, consider whether it's actually working for anyone is something that I hadn't considered before. So yeah, I think that's great.
What other system signs, Jessica? I don't know if
you did great, Billie. I love it. I love your response. And you said a few things that of course get me thinking. It's one of the reasons I love speaking with you. I mean, the all summer few, right? That's a big tell for a systems issue, or the extent of the systems issue, because I kind of think it's always a systems issue. I mean, it could be a systems issue that I have such complex mental health needs that are not being addressed yet, that this system is currently unable, despite the layer of protective factors and the foundation there, we haven't figured it out for me. So or it could be that we say, and I was a former high school teacher, so I'll poke at high school teachers a little bit. 60% of our freshmen are failing Algebra 1. What's wrong with those freshmen, right? So it's the extent of the systems problem. And I think that's, go back to, are we doing what we said we were going to do, which is one of the, I think, really important data pieces, right? We ask, what are we doing? Are we doing what we said we were going to do? And is it getting the intended impact or outcome for kids? Is that, and this is one of the things I think as we know better, we do better here with what you were saying, Billie Jo. It's not just because we kind of need to redefine what works. Because some kids are being quiet, or because I send Megan out in the hallway because I've had enough with her and now I feel better, what is working? And we kind of have to redefine that, and then use our fidelity measures to, as well as other data, kiddo survey data. Is it actually working? So did I help or harm the relationship? Did it teach or reteach the intended skills for a kiddo? I think those are two big questions that help us stay in that evidence-based direction, a protective direction. And then I can ask kids, do you feel like your teacher cares about you? When something goes wrong in the classroom, do you feel like your teacher manages it well? There's this field of study called institutional betrayal that's so interesting to me. And it's the extent to which, when something goes wrong, the institution you were dependent upon takes care of you. So the Army, your college, university, and it was actually started to investigate sexual misconduct in universities. So how is that resolved? What is really interesting to me, though, is the questions that are asked from that process would be so complementary to creating that positive environment in the school. So we think about the sources of data we need from kids. Do they feel taken care of? Do they feel the rules apply to everyone? Are they satisfied even when something goes wrong, that somebody heard them? And those are very important questions for us to ask, particularly related to the needs of kiddos that have been historically underserved and marginalized through the school system. I think it's one of those sources of information, asking kids and asking families, that gives us more information, a really rich story, if you will, and takes us past just how many kids we have failing Algebra 1.
Yeah. Is it working, and who is it working for?
Exactly.
Yeah. I like adding that question to the list of questions we seem to be developing here as we keep going in the conversation. Speaking of those two questions that you mentioned earlier, those are we doing what we said we would do? And what is the impact that it's having? And I think these are two questions that we ask around here all the time, because we always consider fidelity and we always consider outcomes. Now, when I first started knowing anything about the data that schools use, this idea of collecting fidelity data was like, who's doing that? But I know that people are, and I know that it's also important because it gets to this issue of, is it a systems piece? Are we actually doing the thing that we said that we were going to be doing? And if we're not, then before we can even start to talk about how we're going to change something, we need to at least start with a baseline and understand, did this thing that we wanted to do actually work? And who did it work for? So if you are a team who has collected some level of fidelity data and you have some outcome data that's associated with it, whether it's referrals or check and check out point cards or whatever it is. So you've got these two pieces and you've got these two questions to answer. Which comes first? Like, what is the chicken egg situation? Do you look at the fidelity data first and then the outcome? Do you look at them simultaneously? Do you just hope that it comes to you in a fever dream in your team meeting? What do you do? What do you do?
Sort of.
I think so. I think
you throw it like wet pasta on the wall
just like
and just say, what's that?
Whichever sticks.
Whichever sticks.
Yeah, I sort of think in a lot of this good coaching, and maybe Jessica will disagree with me, but you start where there's
Please
interest.
do.
For me, I when I'm working, especially with a new team and building trust or getting to know them, which we do a lot of in our current roles, being more external to a lot of our districts, is starting where that interest is. So if what we're interested in is, did it work? Then let's look at, did it work? And then if it did, why do we think it did? What data do we have to support that? If the interest is in it didn't work, and then kind of going from there, I have found that when we can talk of the questions of the team, so if I'm talking to administrator and they care about money or resources, then we kind of start there, and I frame the data and the conversations and kind of help them look at it through the lens that's going to help them make sense of it. And so I think for me, it's helping kind of paint the story or building that house with that Lego data based on where people are, and shaping that behavior, moving it forward. I know Jessica alluded to that a minute ago too, in a different context, but how rich the conversations are, how sophisticated they are, how much the noodles stick to the wall depends a bit on the team and their comfort and their skills and experience. I know in working the last 7 years in a local school district, when I was with Springfield, it just became the way, eventually it became the way that we operated. We did tiered fidelity inventory a couple times a year. There was no judgment. Teams got excited to do it and see where they were. And we used that purely for action planning. We used it for supporting coaching and professional development. And we helped them link it to their school improvement plans, that same data. So then there were these little pockets of just kind of consistently coming back to, look, here's how you can use this information to improve your work, not as oh, we got you, or, oh, we expect it to be perfect. And then eventually, as a team, we are looking at every single building come before the board and do their board presentations, and they all have put tiered fidelity inventory in their presentation. That was not required, but it's because they were understanding the value of it and what that meant about the work that they were doing, and then they could relate that to the student outcomes that they were getting. So for me, it's always kind of been, where's the interest? Let's start there first, and then help people not lose sight of the rest of the pieces, right? If the interest is in the outcome data, then if they're not getting the outcomes, or they are, but the fidelity is not there, well, what magic happened? What thing happened? Or if it's not working, and we didn't do it, then no wonder we're not seeing the outcomes. So
the thing that I'm listening to the two of you, and the thing that kind of rings in my head is that, this idea that PBIS is a framework, and that it isn't something that you just implement the same way everywhere, that it's just this set of ideas that then you shape to fit your context. And what works in one place may not work in another, or what works with one group of students may not work for another group of students. And there's with that in mind, this whole concept of how do I make sense of my data, it can be really overwhelming. And as I'm sitting here listening to the two of you, there is certainly a value add when you add in good coaching to a team's process. And that, like you were saying, Billie Jo, that as you were working with these teams in Springfield, it became their habit to look at this information in a certain way, and it would never have I could probably guess that that would not have happened if you had not coached them through the process of using these data on a regular basis in a regular kind of way. And so I think that we can talk all day about how should a team tackle their data and use it to inform their decisions. But I think that without that good coaching to get you started, it can be a real hurdle. And the more that you talk about the differences that you've seen with the teams that you've worked with, the more that kind of comes to mind. So I just want to share, I think the work that you're doing is really valuable.
You stole all my notes.
Really?
I actually was just thinking, I mean, one of my big takeaways with this and thinking about this topic and having watched the last couple of nights of NCAA basketball championships, I mean, we call our work, with teams, right? And I think, again, I'm full of analogies today, but with the coaching piece, if you think of it like an athletics coach, it's not go and tell people what to do and then they come back and now they've magically won the national championship.
Right.
It really is this process of assessing where your team is, where they are, what skills do they have, what can we leverage, how are we going to set up our strategies to maximize our strengths. And then how do we also identify what data are we using to identify those places that we need to bolster up our approach, understanding, our context in terms of our student needs, and then doing it over and over again, right? It's that modeling of what it looks like, leading the team through it. I mean, all of the practices that good teachers do in terms of building skills with their students, that's what we do in terms of coaching. We help use the information that's available, get new information if the information's not great, right? We assess a student and they're sick and their reading score is not valid. We don't just move forward as if that represents their reading skills, right? Well, we're gonna clean up that data and kind of working through that same process. So I really think the words coach, when we talk about coaching teams through, I mean, if we can put our heads into that model that we see so often in sports and athletics, I think there's a lot of analogies and parallels there, and how you bring one athlete or one team along is going to look different depending on the context.
Absolutely.
But the evidence base, right, like the practices that are often used are similar, when we kind of start with that foundation of what does a good instruction look like for a certain topic. So yeah, that coaching contextualization, big takeaways in my notes that I'm glad they're coming across.
I agree. The research proves it too, that good coaching or access to coaching has this incredible impact on a school's ability to sustain something over the long term. And I was just reading an article last week about the impact that a data analyst, someone even at the school that has, if you're a team and you have a need to look at data, assigning someone to that, to the job of looking at data first, and then talking as a team about what you saw, just to give people sort of the Cliff Notes version, like these are the big points that we really should discuss, saves everybody time, and it really focuses people on the decisions that need to be made.
Yeah, I think that's great.
Yeah.
Just that add on there. And I do think this is increasingly important. We can see the federal and the state governments in our region in really supporting more counselors in schools, more clinicians in schools, more explicit mental health supports. And if that means we have even more nuanced data, we have more sources of data, we may be considering data from the local prevention office or someplace, like emergency room calls, just different information. And so having someone to help us negotiate that, through the district or in conjunction with the community, I think we understand more explicitly how important it is to invest in mental health. And this is another data set that we aren't necessarily really experts with in the school environment, right? Because we haven't really thought about it in that way yet, right? We're really starting to do that. It's growing.
Yes.
But that person to support that work is has to be an absolute priority. And we've got super smart people around the country doing cost benefit comparisons. Not only how much do we get back when we implement something like PBIS, but how much of that do we get back in terms of math achievement? How much do we get back in terms of, social positive outcomes, right? So we've got stuff like that coming out of Johns Hopkins, but also Columbia Teachers College. So there's groups that are doing that work that I think is really important to show exactly what you were sharing with that article, is that we there's a big return on that investment when we're looking at our data in a district.
Agreed. Well, I really appreciate you all taking the time today to talk through some of this. I feel like we just touched the surface of it all, and that we could have talked for another hour. But I think my big takeaways from our conversation today are all around, like, being sure to include questions around, did we actually do the thing that we set out to do, and really analyzing that in a personal way, but not to take it personally if you didn't. That you really do have to be open and honest and have that dialogue as a team to admit when you didn't succeed in the way that you wanted to, and that you want to try again. So asking that question, did we do what we said we would do? And then taking a look at, like, what was the impact that we saw? Did it work? And who did it work for? And making sure that you include, that you're able first to disaggregate those data and to trust them as reliable, to embed some kind of understanding within your school that data are important and critical, and how you're using them, and that it's not a punishment, it's actually a way to inform the decisions and to shape the way that school works for everyone. But then being able to disaggregate those data, look at those groups, and see how your systems are affecting each of them differently, and then moving from there to see how can we do things differently, and including students and families in those conversations is all really critical. And the way to do that as efficiently as you can is to actually embed a coach within your team to at least get you started through these processes until they become a rhythm in the way that you're doing things, and to ask these people who are so gifted at what they do what to do, because it can be so overwhelming, and a coach can help just shape those conversations and really guide you in your framework. So I learned a lot from all of you, and I really appreciate. I've learned some things. I mean, we've been talking about this stuff for a really long time, and there's always something new to take away. So I really appreciate you taking the time.